The champagne flute in my hand was a hollow, expensive weight, its crystal rim catching the amber glow of a room that wanted me gone. I watched my father, Harrison Porter, lean into the ear of a federal judge, his voice like velvet over gravel as he gestured toward the far corner of the ballroom toward me. "Our Serafina has always struggled with the pressure," he whispered, loud enough for the nearby silk-clad guests to hear, his smile a practiced mask of paternal pity. "She does some filing for the army now, administrative support. It's a quiet life, safe for someone with her limitations." Beside him, my brother Julian Porter nodded, basking in the light of a hero's story he'd spent the last hour stealing from my life. He was wearing the smile I'd seen him practice in mirrors since we were kids, the one that suggested he'd been the one in the mud, the one in the water, the one who made the hard calls. He didn't look at me. To them, I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was a smudge on the family portrait, a secret to be tucked behind a floral arrangement next to the service entrance. The air in the Union Harbor Club was cloying, thick with the scent of jasmine and wood smoke, but I didn't flinch. My back was straight with the muscle memory of a rank they refused to acknowledge. My hand didn't shake. I've lived through mortar fire that made the earth scream, and I've held the hearts of men together with nothing but a pair of forceps and sheer will. A room full of people in tuxedos pretending I'm invisible didn't even register on the scale of things that could break me. I looked down at the table. My father had reached over earlier to hide my forearm with my own silk shawl, his fingers trembling with the fear that someone might see the jagged, silver scar I carried, the physical evidence of the night Julian claimed as his own glory. Harrison thought he was protecting the family legacy. He didn't realize he was burying it alive. From the center of the room, Chief Justice Silas Vance turned, his sharp, gray eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't looking for a clerical assistant. He was looking for a ghost. I reached into my bag and felt the cold, dented edge of the silver compass I'd carried through the flood, the one his son had pressed into my palm when the world was turning to water. I set the flute down on the white linen, the sound lost in the sea of polite laughter. My father thought the night was a coronation. He was wrong. It was a trial. I stood up, the movement slow and tactical, and caught the judge's eye. "The North Star doesn't blink," I murmured, a phrase that meant nothing to my father but would soon mean everything to the room. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the podium. It was time to stop letting them finish the performance. The carpet of the Union Harbor Club was so thick it seemed to swallow the sound of my footsteps as I moved toward the podium. Behind me, I felt the weight of 100 stares, some confused, some irritated, and one specifically, my father's, that felt like a needle pressed against the back of my neck. I didn't look at Harrison. I didn't have to. I knew exactly what his face looked like, that high-tensile mask of civic virtue, the one he wore when he was about to explain away a family misunderstanding. But I wasn't a misunderstanding. Not anymore. My fingers brushed the edge of the dark wood of the lectern. It felt solid. Real. A stark contrast to the hollow, jasmine-scented lies that had been floating through this room since the first cork popped. I looked out over the sea of tuxedos and silk gowns. In the back, near the service door, I could see the table where they had tried to bury me. My mother, Lydia Porter, was halfway out of her chair, her face a pale blur of panic. Beside her, Colonel Miller sat perfectly still, a subtle, grim nod being the only sign that the perimeter was holding. "Good evening," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, not the clipped, tactical bark I used in the field, but something deeper. Controlled. My father mentioned earlier that I work in administrative support, that I keep the records straight. And he's right. Records are important. They're the only thing that survives when the people who were actually there are gone. I saw Julian Porter shift at the main table. He looked small. For 39 years, he had been the son our family orbited, the promising Porter, the hero in waiting. Now, he just looked like a man realized he'd left his script at home. I thought back to the Maryland night just 48 hours ago, sitting in my office with the glow of the monitors stinging my eyes. I remembered the exact moment I'd opened the digital file that Silas Vance had eventually unlocked. It wasn't just a mission log. It was a triage map. I saw the names of the men I'd stabilized while the water rose, names my father had never bothered to learn. Harrison had called my service unfortunate. A phase that had lasted too long. To him, my medals were just jagged pieces of metal that didn't match the family silver. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the industrial refrigerator in the kitchen behind me. I looked at Chief Justice Silas Vance. He was leaning forward now, his chin resting on a knotted fist. He wasn't looking at a daughter, he was looking at a captain. He was looking for the woman who had whispered to his son in the dark. In the army, I continued, my gaze drifting to the jagged scar hidden beneath my black silk sleeve. We have a term for what happens when the map doesn't match the ground. We call it a reality fracture. You can try to navigate by the map all you want, but if there's a cliff in front of you that isn't on the paper, you're still going to fall. I looked directly at Harrison then. He wasn't flinching, but I saw the way his hand gripped his wine glass, the knuckles white, the tendons in his forearm taut. He was still trying to manage the moment. My father has spent a lot of time drawing maps for this family. He knows exactly where everyone is supposed to sit. He knows which stories are simple enough for a night like this. But the ground is a different thing entirely. I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out my challenge coins. I didn't slam them down. I placed them on the wood, one by one. The clink of the metal was the only truth in the room. I didn't come here to be a complication, I said, my voice dropping an octave, reaching for that soldier stoicism that had kept me alive when the world turned to mud. I came here because a debt was owed. Not to me, to the truth of what happened 3 years ago. My brother Julian is a lot of things. He's charming, he's ambitious, but he has never been the person who stays in the water when the radio goes dead. I saw Julian's jaw drop. A woman at the Vance table gasped, a sharp, aspirated sound that broke the tension like a glass shattering. Harrison started to stand, his face darkening into a shade of bruised purple. "Serafina, that's enough," he said, his voice a low, vibrating warning. I didn't look at him, I looked at Alina Vance. She was staring at Julian, her eyes wide, searching his face for a denial that wasn't coming. The validation gap wasn't just a distance anymore, it was a canyon. "I sat at the back tonight," I said, turning back to the room. "Because that's where the extra guests go, the unnecessary ones, the ghosts. But the thing about ghosts is that we see everything. We see the performance from the wings, and the performance is over." I felt a strange, cold clarity. The compressed spring of 39 years had finally snapped, and as I stood there in the amber light of the Union Harbor Club, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for Harrison Porter's permission to breathe. I was Serafina Porter, and I was finally, irrevocably, taking the high ground. The smell of the Union Harbor Club was starting to get to me. It was too clean, that aggressive, artificial purity of jasmine and beeswax that tries to convince you that nothing ugly has ever happened within its walls. I stepped away from the podium, the silence behind me a physical weight. My father hadn't moved. He was a statue of frozen prestige, his wine glass still suspended halfway to a mouth that had finally run out of lies. I didn't wait for the applause that wouldn't come. I moved toward the side exit, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the hardwood. Left, left, tactical breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. I needed air that hadn't been filtered through a $5,000 HVAC system. I pushed through the heavy oak doors leading to the stone terrace. The Maryland night hit me like a cold compress. It was sharp, tasting of salt from the harbor and the metallic tang of an incoming storm. I leaned against the stone balustrade, my hands gripping the cold granite. My knuckles were white, the skin stretched tight over the bones. The soldier's stoicism was a heavy cloak. It kept the world out, but it kept the heat in, too. I looked at my forearm. I pulled back the silk sleeve of my dress, exposing the scar. In the dim amber light of the terrace lanterns, it looked like a jagged silver river. A reality fracture. My father had spent years telling me he'd used his connections to bury the paperwork from that night in Kandahar. He'd made it sound like a mercy. "I made the reprimand go away, Serafina. I saved your career from your own impulsiveness." I'd believed him. For 3 years, I'd carried the guilt of a disciplinary mess that didn't exist. I closed my eyes, and the white noise of the gala faded into the red zone of my memory. Kandahar, 3 years ago. The rain wasn't a drizzle, it was a wall of liquid lead. The valley was screaming. I was knee-deep in red slurry, the smell of burnt diesel and iron-rich mud clogging my sinuses. The radio in my ear was a jagged mess of static and panic. "Captain Porter, the perimeter is collapsing. Retreat to the LZ. That's an order." I looked at the collapsed medical hut. A civilian volunteer was pinned under a support beam, his eyes two white orbs of terror in a face masked by silt. He was clutching a small, dented silver compass. The Priority 1 assets were already on the bird. The smart move, the Porter move, was to leave him, to keep the map clean. I didn't move toward the chopper. I moved toward the mud. I crawled into the dark, the space smelling of wet wood and copper. I found his leg. The femoral artery was a pulsing fountain of heat. I didn't have a tourniquet left. I used my thumb. I pressed down into the grit, feeling the life thudding against my bone. "The North Star doesn't blink," I whispered, my voice a low vibration against his ear. "And neither do I stay with the light." He squeezed my hand. 3 pulses, short, hard, a code of survival. A door creaked open behind me. I didn't turn. I knew the weight of that step. "Serafina," it was Julian. His voice was thin, stripped of the practiced resonance he used for the Vances. I turned slowly. He was standing in the shadows, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his silk tie hanging loose like a noose. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. "The radio silence," he said, his voice trembling. "How did you know? You weren't even on that frequency." "I was the one who wrote the encryption key, Julian," I said. My voice was flat, empty. I didn't need to be on the frequency to know why the air went dead. I was the one holding the blood back while you were sitting in the TOC with a headset turned off because the static gave you a migraine. He took a step toward me, his hands out in a gesture of supplication. "Dad said it was for the family. He said the Vances needed to see a leader. He said you were already too far gone into the dark stuff, that you wouldn't want the spotlight anyway." "The spotlight?" I looked at him, and for a second I felt a flash of genuine pity. "You think I did it for a seat at a table, Julian? I did it so a father didn't have to bury a son. Something you wouldn't understand, because you've never looked at a man and realized you're the only thing standing between him and a hole in the ground." "Elena is leaving," he whispered. "The judge," he called someone, "my security clearance is being flagged for review." "Good," I said. I turned back to the harbor. The mystery of the level 4 lock on my file finally made sense. It wasn't my father's connections that had restricted it. Silas Vance had seen the original, unredacted triage map. He had locked the file to protect the integrity of a federal inquiry into the very evacuation Julian had just claimed to lead. My father hadn't buried my shame. He had been trying to hide the evidence of his son's cowardice. "Go inside, Julian," I said, not looking back. "The performance is over. Try to find a chair that doesn't belong to someone else." He lingered for a moment, the silence between us a jagged canyon. Then the door clicked shut. I was alone on the terrace. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small, dented silver compass. I'd kept it for 3 years, a quiet weight in the bottom of my kit. I held it in my palm, the metal cold against my skin. I wasn't a clerical assistant. I wasn't an unfortunate phase. I was Serafina Porter. And the North Star was finally, for the first time in 39 years, exactly where it was supposed to be. The storm was coming. I could smell the rain. But for the first time, I wasn't the one tasked with holding the world together. I was just the one walking through it. The ballroom felt like a pressurized chamber. I walked back inside, the transition from the sharp harbor air to the jasmine-choked heat of the Union Harbor Club hitting me like a physical wall. The room hadn't changed, but the geometry of it had. The gazes that followed me now weren't dismissive. They were heavy with a new, uncomfortable curiosity. I moved past the velvet curtains and took my seat at the service table. Colonel Miller didn't look up from her glass. She didn't need to. Her posture was a calibrated signal of hold the line. "Julian's spiraling," she murmured, her voice barely a vibration. "I know," I said. I looked at the main table. My father was leaning in toward Chief Justice Silas Vance, his hands moving in a frantic, low-level pantomime of explanation. Silas wasn't nodding. He was perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the silver compass sitting on the white linen between them like a live grenade. Harrison caught my eye. For a split second, the mask of the statesman slipped. I saw the raw, jagged edges of a man who realized the daughter he'd spent 39 years editing out of the script was now the only one holding the pen. He looked away, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles in his neck strained. The validation gap wasn't a distance anymore. It was a casualty list. The waiters began the second course, their movements choreographed and silent. They laid down plates of pan-seared scallops that looked too fragile to eat. I watched the server at the main table. He was young, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the Vances. He was about to set a plate down in front of Alina's mother, a plate garnished with a heavy dusting of crushed pistachios. I remembered the file, Alina's mother, severe anaphylaxis, nut-free protocol. I stood up. I didn't run. I moved with the economy of motion of a triage lead crossing a chaotic deck. I reached the table just as the plate began its descent. My hand shot out, my fingers gripping the server's wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to stop the world. "Stop," I said. The word was a flat, tactical command. The server froze, the table went silent. Harrison looked like he was about to explode. "Serafina, what on earth?" "Check the ticket," I said, my eyes locked on the server. "Table 4, no nuts, cross-contamination risk." The server blinked, looked at the plate, then at his handwritten slip. His face went ghostly. I'm so sorry, I picked up the wrong tray." I released his wrist. "Take it back, get a clean plate from the chef, personally." He nodded frantically and vanished toward the kitchen. I stood there for a heartbeat, the center of gravity in the room shifting entirely to the space between me and Silas Vance. "You have a good eye for detail, Captain," Silas said. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation of fact. "Detail is what keeps people alive, sir," I replied. I turned to walk back to my shadows, but Alina Vance stood up. She wasn't looking at Julian. She was looking at the jagged silver scar on my forearm, the one Harrison had tried to hide with a silk shawl. "You said you handled the records, Serafina," Alina said, her voice carrying that sharp, prosecutorial edge. "But Julian told me he was the one who personally checked the dietary restrictions for the gala. He said he spent all morning with the caterers to ensure his future mother-in-law was safe." I looked at Julian. He was staring at his empty glass, his face a shade of gray I usually only saw in shock victims. "Julian likes the idea of being the one who cares," I said, my voice low and disciplined. "But caring is a high-maintenance job. It requires you to be present, not just in the room, but in the truth." "Is that why your record is restricted?" Silas Vance asked. He leaned forward, his hands clasped over the silver compass. "Because the truth was too high maintenance for the Porter family." I thought of the Maryland night, the smell of burnt ozone in my office, and the access denied flash on my screen. I realized Silas wasn't asking a question. He was confirming a theory. "My father told me he buried my record to save my career," I said. "He told me he made the reprimand go away." "There was no reprimand, Captain," Silas said. He stood up, his height filling the space like a gavel stroke. "I know because I'm the one who issued the Level 4 lock. I didn't do it to hide a failure. I did it because your field assessment on command accountability is the cornerstone of a federal inquiry into Julian's former firm. They were looking for a scapegoat. I made sure they couldn't find you." The cracks in the mirror shattered. I looked at Harrison. He wasn't the man with the connections. He was the man who had been frantically trying to hide his son's cowardice behind my sacrifice, terrified that the Justice Department would find the daughter he'd spent a lifetime diminishing. "Go back to your table, Serafina," my father whispered, his voice sounding like dry paper tearing. "Please, for the family." "The family died on a Tuesday in Kandahar, Dad," I said. "I'm just here to witness the burial." I walked back to the service entrance. The hydrangeas didn't feel like a cage anymore. They felt like a perimeter. I sat down, the weight of the phantom pack finally beginning to lift. I wasn't the clerical support. I wasn't the unfortunate phase. I was the only person in this room who didn't need a map to find the truth. I was Serafina Porter, and the performance wasn't just over. The stage was on fire. The dining hall had become a study in strategic segregation. I sat behind the hydrangeas, the white petals looking like frozen explosions in the dim light. From here, the world was a collection of half-heard sentences and the rhythmic, mechanical sounds of a high-end kitchen. The service entrance protocol was in full effect. My father had placed me exactly where he thought I would be most manageable, close enough to count as family, but far enough as a ghost. My mother, Lydia, drifted by once. She didn't stop. She just leaned down, her fingers grazing my shoulder for a second. Her touch was cold. "Just stay here, Serafina," she whispered, her voice tight with a desperate, practiced hope. "Julian is almost through his toast. Let him have this, please." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I just watched her move back toward the light, her silk dress shimmering like oil on water. I looked at the elite table. My father, Harrison, stood up. He smoothed the front of his tuxedo, a gesture of absolute confidence that I knew was a lie. He raised his glass, the crystal catching the amber glow of the chandeliers. "A Porter family tradition," Harrison began, his voice projecting with that warm, resonant authority that had fooled me for 30 years. "It's a tradition of service. Julian has always embodied that." I remember the 2023 floods. While the rest of the world was paralyzed, Julian was on the ground. He was the one who coordinated the relief. He was the one who made the hard calls when the water was at the doorframe. I felt the validation gap rip open in my chest. It was a physical sensation, like a suture pulling through skin. The 2023 floods. The water wasn't a metaphor, it was a hungry, brown god. It smelled of raw sewage and diesel. I was behind the wheel of a 5-ton transport truck, the engine screaming as the water rose past the headlights. My left shoulder was screaming, too, the phantom weight of the trauma pack I'd been wearing for 30 hours. I was alone in that cab. Julian was 5 miles away in a climate-controlled command center, his only contribution being a series of increasingly panicked radio checks that I eventually ignored. I reached the orphanage. The water was waist-deep. I didn't wait for coordination. I jumped into the sludge, the cold hitting me like a hammer. I carried 14 children, one by one, to the truck. My hands were raw, the skin pruned and bleeding. I remember the weight of the last one, a girl no older than 6, clutching a wet teddy bear. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a machine. I felt like a porter. "Julian led from the front," Harrison continued, his voice dripping with paternal pride. He even handled the radio himself when the technical failures threatened the mission. He kept the record straight. I gripped my linen napkin. The weight of the phantom pack was back. It was the weight of the truth that Harrison was plagiarizing in real time. He was taking my blood and my sweat and my 36 hours of exhaustion and pinning it to Julian's chest like a medal. Colonel Miller leaned toward me. Her eyes were hard, scanning the room like she was looking for a target. "He's reading from the script, Porter. Your father isn't just lying, he's selling. He's trying to convince Silas Vance that Julian is the one the DOJ should be talking to." "I know," I said. My voice was a flat, tactical rasp. I looked at the Vances. Elena was leaning back, her arms crossed. She wasn't looking at Julian. She was looking at her father. Silas Vance wasn't looking at Harrison. He was staring at the small, handwritten note a server had just placed near his water glass. "Porter," Miller whispered, "look at the door." I shifted my gaze. Standing near the entrance was a man in a dark suit, not a guest, not a waiter. He had the command presence of a federal agent. He was watching Silas Vance. The realization hit me with the force of a kinetic strike. This dinner wasn't an engagement party. It was a deposition. Silas Vance had locked my record because he knew I was the only person who could verify the administrative lie Harrison was currently spinning. My father thought he was burying my shame by seating me at the service entrance. He didn't realize he'd placed the star witness in the best seat in the house. Julian began his toast now, his voice a practiced, low murmur of humility. He was using military jargon he'd heard me use at Thanksgiving: operational tempo, tactical withdrawal, asset recovery. He was wearing my life like a stolen coat. "I sat at the radio," Julian lied, his eyes meeting Silas Vance's. "I knew that if I didn't keep the link open, we'd lose them. I didn't care about the risk. I just cared about the kids." The spring was at its limit. I could feel the tension vibrating in the air. I looked at the silver compass sitting on the table near Silas. It was a sensory anchor, a piece of the red zone in the middle of this sterile, perfumed world. I stood up. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The movement alone was enough to draw Silas Vance's eyes. He looked at me, then back at Julian, then down at the compass. The connection was made. The validation gap was about to be closed with a gavel stroke. "The radio didn't fail, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his toast like a knife through silk. The room went silent. Harrison's glass stopped halfway to his lips. Julian's face turned a shade of gray that I only saw in the triage tent. "The operator stayed silent to save lives," I said. "You'd know that if you'd ever been in the water." I walked toward the light. The service entrance protocol was over. The truth was out of the bag, and it was the only thing in the room that had any weight. The air in the Union Harbor Club felt thin, like the oxygen was being sucked out by the sheer density of the lies filling the room. At my table, tucked away in the architectural blind spot of the hydrangeas, the dinner progressed in a blur of clinking crystal and muffled kitchen sounds. I sat with my back straight, a habit of rank. My father had often described it as socially rigid. Beside me, Colonel Miller was a statue of quiet defiance. I watched Julian through the gaps in the floral arrangement. He was at the center of the elite table, gesturing with his wine glass as if it were a tactical pointer. He was deep into the story of the orphanage rescue, his voice rising with a rehearsed, cinematic tremor that set my teeth on edge. "The water was at the doorframe," Julian said, leaning toward Alina. He looked like a man who had never seen a day of dirt. I had to decide. Do we wait for the air support that might never come, or do we start the transport? I looked at those kids, and I knew I couldn't wait. I gave the order to move. I felt a phantom throb in my left shoulder. It was a sharp, pulsing reminder of the 40-pound trauma pack I'd carried for 36 hours straight during that flood. My body remembered the truth, even if the people in this room were trying to rewrite it. The water wasn't at the doorframe when the rescue began. It was at our waists. Cold, thick with debris, smelling of raw sewage and failed infrastructure. Julian hadn't been in the water. He had been 5 miles away in a dry command center, coordinating via a radio that he eventually turned off because the static gave him a headache. "Stay with me, Porter," Miller whispered. Her voice was barely a vibration. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a small, encrypted tablet, sliding the screen toward me under the edge of the white linen. I finally broke the digital seal on that level 4 lock. I looked down, my breath hitched. It wasn't a reprimand. It wasn't the disciplinary mess my father had used to keep me in line for years. It was a star witness summons from the Department of Justice. My file wasn't restricted to hide my shame. It was restricted because Silas Vance, in his role as Chief Justice, had flagged my field assessment on operational ethics as primary federal evidence. "The Vances aren't just here for a wedding, Serafina," Miller breathed, her eyes scanning the room like a sniper. "They're here on a hunt. Your father knows the DOJ is looking for the lion of the triage, but he's convinced them, and Julian, that the lion is Julian. He's trying to trade your service for Julian's seat on a federal board. He's selling your life to buy his son a legacy." I looked at my father. He was laughing at a joke Silas had made, his face the picture of patriarchal pride. He looked refined, polished, a man of complete sentences. He was selling my soul to buy a future for a son who couldn't stand in a rainstorm without an umbrella. The debt of justice I owed wasn't just to myself anymore. It was to the truth of the people I'd saved. I thought back to the triage tent, the smell of wet wool and the rhythmic thump-thump of the rotors. I remembered the weight of the last child I'd pulled from the truck. She had been shivering, her small hands clutching my wet uniform. I hadn't been an administrative adjustment then. I had been the only thing between her and the dark. "Is the sea bass to your liking, Captain?" The waiter startled me. I looked up. He was holding a bottle of expensive Chardonnay, waiting for me to acknowledge his existence. "It's fine," I said. My voice was a flat, tactical rasp. I looked back at the main table. Silas Vance was staring at me. He wasn't looking at the hydrangeas, he was looking through them. He looked at the way I held my fork with the economy of motion of a woman who didn't waste energy on social performance. He looked at the jagged silver scar on my forearm that I had deliberately allowed to peek out from my sleeve. The validation gap was closing. I could feel the tension in the air, a high-frequency hum that signaled the end of a long, quiet war. My father thought he had tucked me away in a corner where I couldn't be heard. He didn't realize he'd placed the only person who knew where the bodies were buried exactly where I could see the shovel in his hand. "Porter," Miller murmured. "The judge just checked his watch. The performance is almost over." I gripped my napkin until my knuckles were white. The weight of the Phantom pack felt heavier than ever, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like armor. I wasn't the unfortunate phase. I wasn't the clerical daughter. I was the witness, and the truth was about to walk into the light. The main course sat between us like a peace treaty no one intended to sign. The sea bass was white, flaky, and bloodless, as sterile as the narrative my father was currently spinning. I didn't touch it. My appetite had stayed behind in my office, buried under the weight of a level 4 restricted file. Across the room, the amber light of the chandeliers caught the gold in my father's signet ring as he stood up. Harrison Porter didn't just take a room, he occupied it. He possessed the kind of practiced, American authority that made people straighten their ties and lower their voices. He looked at the Vances, then at Julian, and finally, his gaze swept over the hydrangeas to the service table. He didn't see me, he saw a placeholder. "We are honored to join with the Vance family," Harrison began. His voice was a rich, resonant baritone that carried easily to the back of the hall. "A family that understands that leadership isn't about the spotlight, but the burden of the high ground. Julian has shown he is ready for that burden. He was there when the water rose, making the hard calls." He paused, a master of the theatrical beat. "And while his sister, Serafina, has found her own path in administrative support, keeping the records straight for the brave boys overseas, it is Julian who carries the flame of the Porter legacy into the field." Administrative support. The phrase hit me with a physical force, sharper than a shrapnel nick. I felt the guests at the surrounding tables shift. I could feel their pity through the floral arrangement. To them, I was the clerical daughter, the one who couldn't handle the dark stuff, the one who stayed behind to file the paperwork while the men did the bleeding. Beside me, Colonel Miller let out a breath so thin it was almost a whistle. "He's burying you, Porter, in a tuxedo." I didn't answer. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I thought about the records I'd actually kept. I thought about the triage tags I'd written in permanent marker on the skin of shivering men because we'd run out of paper. I thought about the manifest of the orphanage rescue, the real manifest, not the one Julian was currently nodding along to. The validation gap wasn't just a distance anymore. It was a casualty list. "Is that right, Serafina?" The voice was cool, precise, and aimed directly at my table. Elena Vance had turned in her chair. She was ignoring the toast, ignoring Julian, and looking straight through the white petals of the hydrangeas. Her eyes were like a prosecutor's. They didn't want a story, they wanted a confession. "Julian says you handle the logs for his missions," Elena continued. "That you're the one who ensures the integrity of the family history. That must be a heavy responsibility." The room went quiet. The clink of silverware stopped. My father's glass was frozen halfway to his lips. Julian's face was a shade of gray I usually only saw in the triage tent after the morphine ran out. He looked at me, a silent, desperate plea vibrating in his eyes. "Stay small. Keep it simple. Don't ruin this." I stood up. I didn't rush. I moved with the calibrated economy of a woman who had spent a decade making decisions in seconds. I stepped out from behind the hydrangeas and into the light. "I handle the records, Elena," I said. My voice was flat, tactical, and projected with the authority of a command briefing. I didn't look at Harrison. I looked at the Chief Justice. Because in the Army, we have a saying, if you don't document the truth, someone will eventually try to sell you a lie. I don't just keep records. I witness. I witness the decisions made in the mud, and I witness the people who were never there to make them. I felt the validation gap snap shut. The administrative lie was dead on the floor. "Julian," I said, turning to my brother. "The log for the orphanage extraction noted a radio silence of 6 minutes. You told Elena it was a technical failure, a glitch." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat that had gone dry. "It was. The static, Serafina. You weren't there, you don't know." "The radio didn't fail," I said, my voice cutting through the jasmine-scented air like a scalpel. "The operator on the ground made a tactical choice to go silent because looters were closing in on the ridge. That silence wasn't a malfunction. It was a shield. You'd know that if you'd ever been in the water. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's face was no longer the mask of a statesman. It was the face of a man who realized the lion was finally out of the cage." Silas Vance stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on me, the silver compass on the table between us looking like the only real thing in the room. "Captain Porter," the judge said, his voice a low rumble, "I believe it's time we discuss the administrative support you provided for my son." The performance was over. The stage was empty, and for the first time in 39 years, I was the only one with a microphone. The air in the Union Harbor Club had turned from stagnant luxury to the charged, pre-storm static of a battlefield. My father's face was a map of controlled fury. the skin pulled tight over his cheekbones until he looked like a death mask of the man who had walked in here. He tried to reclaim the room. His hand reached for the mahogany podium, gripping it like a life raft in a swelling sea. Serafina has always had a flair for the dramatic, Harrison said. He forced a chuckle. It sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. Military service tends to oversensitize the mind. Julian, why don't you clarify the technicalities of the radio silence for Judge Vance? I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for the discrepancy in the clerical logs. This was the final performance. Harrison was doubling down, betting that Julian's charm could still outrun my truth. He was betting that a clerk couldn't possibly topple a hero. Julian leaned forward. His hands were splayed on the white linen, fingers twitching. He was sweating now. Fine beads of moisture caught the amber light along his hairline. "The captain is right about the protocol," he said. His voice was a desperate, pitchy imitation of authority. But she wasn't on the ground. She was back at the TOC. I made the call to go silent when I saw the looters' silhouettes on the ridge. I didn't want to worry the record keepers with the danger of the moment. It was a masterpiece of narcissism. He was attempting to absorb my tactical brilliance into his own narrative while simultaneously dismissing me as a fragile girl who needed protection from the real world. I felt the debt of justice vibrate in the marrow of my bones. I didn't look at my brother. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at Silas Vance. The Chief Justice wasn't looking at Julian anymore. He was reaching into his breast pocket. His eyes were fixed on me with a terrifying, piercing clarity that seemed to strip away the silk of my dress and the polish of the room. He pulled out a small, dented silver compass. The room froze. The sight of the metal, dull, scratched, and decidedly out of place among the crystal and silver, acted as a sensory anchor. It dragged the entire gala back to the mud of Kandahar. "My son carried this," Silas said. His voice dropped to a low, judicial rumble that commanded every ear in the room. "He told me that the man who saved him was a shadow in the rain. But he also told me that the man's sister, the woman on the radio, was the one who actually mapped the extraction route through the flood." He turned the compass over in his hand. The metal caught the light, showing a deep gouge near the hinge. "But there's a problem with your story, Julian. My son isn't just a volunteer. He's a radio technician. And he told me that during those 6 minutes of silence, someone didn't just make a call. They whispered a specific phrase to keep him from going into shock." Julian's mouth opened. No sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping on a dry deck. The spring was at its absolute limit. The lie had been funneled into a corner where charm had no currency. I thought back to the triage tent, the smell of wet wool, the rhythmic thump-thump of the rotors. I remembered the exact weight of that compass when I'd tucked it back into the boy's pocket. "Harrison," Silas said, turning his head slowly toward my father. "You told me Serafina was administrative support. You told me she struggled with the pressure." "She did," Harrison whispered. He looked like he was shrinking. "She's unstable, Silas, the reports." "The reports I unlocked today tell a different story," Silas interrupted. He stood up. The movement was quiet but absolute. "They tell a story of a captain who held a perimeter alone while her coordinator brother was being evacuated for a panic attack. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Julian's hands were shaking so hard now the silverware rattled against the porcelain. Elena Vance was staring at him, her face a mask of dawning horror. She wasn't just seeing a liar, she was seeing the vacuum where a man should have been. I stood my ground. I didn't feel the need to shout. The truth was a physical presence in the room, more solid than the brick walls of the club. "You wanted it to be simple, Julian," I said. My voice was a low, disciplined hum. "You wanted me to be the ghost in the machine. But a ghost is the only thing that sees the truth when everyone else is looking at the performance." Silas Vance walked toward me. He ignored the head table. He ignored my father's trembling hand. He stopped at the edge of the hydrangeas. "Captain Porter," he said, "I believe we're done with the fiction." The snap was coming. I could feel it in the air. The compressed spring of 39 years was about to break the spine of the Porter legacy, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one tasked with holding the pieces together. I was just the witness. The snap didn't happen with a shout. It happened with the quiet, rhythmic sound of Silas Vance's footsteps as he stood up and walked away from the elite table. He bypassed my father, ignored Julian's outstretched hand, and walked straight toward the hydrangeas that masked my service table. The room was a vacuum, no one breathed. Silas reached the floral arrangement and pushed it aside with a sharp, impatient motion. The white petals scattered like ash. The barrier was gone. I was no longer a ghost, I was the focus. Every eye in the club followed him. "Captain Serafina Porter," Silas said. His voice echoed off the dark wood paneling, resonant and final. "I've spent the last 48 hours reviewing a Level 4 restricted file. I wanted to see if the woman who saved my son was truly as diminished as her family claimed she was." He sat down in the empty chair across from me. He didn't ask. He just occupied the space, effectively relocating the center of the gala to the service entrance. The tray of dirty appetizer plates on the nearby sideboard seemed to mock the tuxedos at the main table. "I found your field assessment, Captain," Silas continued. "The one regarding command accountability. I quoted it in my latest dissent on the federal bench. It's a masterpiece of ethical clarity. I didn't realize the author was being hidden behind a bread basket." The climax hit the room like a kinetic strike. My father, Harrison, took a step toward us, his face a mask of crumbling prestige. The complete sentences he usually relied on were failing him. "Silas, surely, you can't mean to take the word of a..." "A what, Harrison?" Silas interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but it had the edge of a guillotine. "A hero, a leader, someone who actually stood in the mud while your son was being treated for exhaustion in a dry tent." I stood up. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel the soldier's stoicism as a cage anymore. It was a platform. I looked at Julian. He was staring at his plate as if it had turned into an abyss. He looked hollow, a man made of expensive wool and borrowed stories. I looked at Alina Vance. She was standing now, too. She wasn't looking at the judge or the porters. She was looking at the jagged silver scar on my forearm, the reality fracture my father had tried so hard to keep in the dark. She reached up and touched the engagement ring on her finger. It looked heavy. "Wrong. The North Star doesn't blink, Julian," I said. My voice was steady, carrying the weight of the 39 years I had spent making myself smaller for their comfort. "And neither do I. You wanted me to arrive as a stranger. You got your wish, because after tonight, I don't recognize any of you." The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the sound. Clink. Alina Vance placed the engagement ring on the table. It was a small sound, but in that room, it sounded like a structural failure. "I think we're done here," Alina said. Her voice was as final as a closing door. Silas Vance stood and offered me his arm. He didn't look at Harrison. He didn't acknowledge the wreckage of the dinner. "Captain, I believe there is a car waiting outside that can take you somewhere that understands the value of a name like Serafina Porter." As I walked out of the room, my head held high, I didn't look back at the ruins of the dinner. I didn't need to see my father's face or Julian's collapse. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the exit doors. The validation gap was gone. I was Serafina Porter. I was a captain. And for the first time in my life, I was the only one holding the map. The air outside was cold, smelling of the coming rain. It felt like home. The vacuum of silence that followed Silas Vance's departure from the head table was more deafening than any mortar blast I had ever survived. I stood beside the service table, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. Across the room, the elite table looked like a stage where the actors had forgotten their lines while the curtain was still up. Julian was the first to move. He didn't reach for Alina, he reached for the wine bottle. His hand trembled so violently that the neck of the bottle clattered against the rim of his glass. Chink, chink, chink. It was the sound of a man realizing that his currency had just been declared worthless. "Alina, wait," Julian choked out. "This is a misunderstanding. Serafina, she's always been jealous. She's twisting the facts to hurt me because she couldn't cut it in the real world." Alina Vance didn't even look at him. She was looking at me, her expression a mix of profound apology and a newfound, sharp respect. She reached out and touched the engagement ring she had just placed on the table, pushing it an inch further away from Julian with a slow, deliberate finger. "She didn't twist anything, Julian," Alina said. "You did. You didn't just lie to me about your sister. You tried to build a life on the bones of her sacrifice. You're not a hero, Julian, you're a thief." My mother, Lydia, finally broke. She rushed toward me, her heels clicking frantically against the floor, the sound echoing like small arms fire in the quiet room. "Serafina, talk to Silas. Tell him it was a joke. Tell him we were just trying to keep the night focused on the couple. You're ruining your brother's life." I looked at her. For the first time, the soldier's stoicism didn't feel like a shield, it felt like a mirror. I saw her desperation, her fear of a broken image, and I felt nothing, no anger, no heat, just the cold clarity of a mission completed. "I didn't ruin his life, Mom," I said. "I just stopped helping him lie about mine. The debt of justice was overdue. I'm just the one who finally collected." My father, Harrison, remained at the head of the room. He looked at the Vances, then at the empty seat Silas had vacated, and finally at me. For a second, I saw the validation gap in his eyes. The moment he realized the unnecessary complication he had tried to hide was the only thing that actually made the Porter name worth mentioning. He didn't apologize. He just turned away, his shoulders slumped, looking suddenly like an old man who had gambled his daughter's dignity and lost the house. Colonel Miller stood up beside me. She didn't say anything. She just placed a hand on my shoulder, a firm, grounding weight that said perimeter secure. I looked at Julian one last time. He looked small. A man made of expensive wool and borrowed glory, now standing in the wreckage of a narrative he couldn't sustain. "The records are straight now, Julian," I murmured, loud enough only for the shadows near the kitchen door. I turned toward the exit. I didn't rush. I moved with the calibrated economy of a woman who had spent a decade making decisions in seconds. I walked past the hydrangeas, past the elite guests who were now whispering my name, and toward the cold, honest air of the Maryland night. The performance was over. The stage was empty. And for the first time in 39 years, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The air outside the Union Harbor Club was sharp. It tasted of salt from the Potomac and the heavy, metallic humidity of the coming storm, the same premission scent that had filled my lungs in the floodlands 3 years ago. I stood on the curb, the city lights shimmering on the wet pavement like scattered brass casings. Behind me, the club's heavy oak doors remained shut, but I could still feel the heat of the room I'd just left. Silas Vance's car sat idling 10 yards away, its exhaust a thin, ghostly plume in the cold air. The ending, a heavy, uneven footstep sounded on the stone steps behind me. I didn't turn. I knew the weight of that gate. I knew the specific rhythm of the man who had spent 39 years trying to pace the perimeter of my life. "Serafina." Harrison's voice was raspy. The polished, cello-like resonance was gone, replaced by a desperate, jagged edge. I watched his reflection in the tinted glass of a parked sedan. He looked smaller. The old money suit didn't seem to fit quite right anymore. "We can still manage this," he said, reaching me. He didn't come for an apology. He came for a strategy. He was already pulling his phone from his breast pocket, his fingers fumbling with the screen. "I'll call the editorial board at the Post. We'll frame this as a family of heroes piece, the captain and the coordinator. A misunderstanding of roles in the heat of a high-stakes night. We'll say the dinner was a private test of character. Silas will respect a good recovery. He's a man of the institution, Serafina. He understands the need for a clean narrative." I turned to him slowly. The soldier's stoicism I'd worn like a flak jacket all night didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like part of my skin. I looked at the man who had spent a lifetime treating my competence like a freak accident, a detour from the polished life he'd bought for Julian. "There is no we, Harrison," I said. The word father stayed buried. "That title is a rank you earn through protection, not just through blood. You asked me to arrive as a stranger. You told me it would be simpler that way. I've decided to take your advice. From this moment on, I am a stranger to the Porters." He blinked, the phone halfway to his ear. "Don't be dramatic. You're emotional. It's the adrenaline. We're family." "No," I said. My voice was a flat, tactical line. "Family is the person who holds the femoral artery shut in the mud while the world is screaming. Family is the person who refuses to leave the extraction zone when the radio goes dead. You're just the man who sat in the dry tent and tried to sell the movie rights." I reached into my bag and pulled out the small, dented silver compass. The one Silas's son had gripped until his knuckles were as white as my father's are now. I held it out. "Give this to Julian," I said. "Tell him to look at it every time he thinks about telling a story that isn't his. Tell him the North Star doesn't blink, but it also doesn't wait for people who are too busy admiring their own reflection to notice they're lost." Harrison stared at the compass. He didn't take it. His hands stayed at his sides, trembling slightly. I didn't wait for him to find his complete sentences. I set the compass on a stone pillar near the curb and walked toward Silas Vance's car. "Serafina," he called out, a note of genuine, raw panic finally breaking through the facade. "What am I supposed to tell the Vances? What happens to the family legacy?" I paused with my hand on the car door. I looked back at the Union Harbor Club, a beautiful, hollow building filled with expensive people who lived in the validation gap. "Tell them the truth, Harrison," I said. "Tell them Serafina Porter completed her final mission for this unit. The perimeter is closed." I stepped into the car. The door shut with a solid, pressurized thud that cut off the world. As we pulled away into the dark, I looked at my reflection in the window. The phantom weight on my shoulder was gone. I wasn't a secret, a ghost, or an administrative footnote. I was Serafina Porter. I was a captain. And for the first time in 39 years, I wasn't waiting for anyone to tell me where I stood. I knew exactly where the high ground was. The rain started then, hard, honest drops that washed the city clean. I leaned my head back against the seat and watched the North Star through the clouds. It wasn't blinking, and neither was I. Truth is a heavy thing. It's not just the absence of lies. It's a physical weight we carry in the marrow of our bones, a quiet resonance that either steadies our hands or makes them shake. We often spend our lives trying to fit into the blueprints others have drawn for us, shrinking our edges and softening our voices until we're nothing more than a character in someone else's play. But there is an inherent, rugged dignity in being exactly who you are, especially when that reality is inconvenient for the people who want to keep the room pretty. Respect isn't something you can inherit or manufacture through a well-timed toast. It's earned in the mud, in the silence, and in the moments when no one is watching but the stars. To diminish another person's value to bolster your own isn't just a betrayal of them. It's a confession of your own emptiness. True legacy isn't built on the stories we tell about ourselves, but on the quiet integrity of our actions when the radio goes dead and the water starts to rise. It's about understanding that every person in the room has a name, a history, and a weight of their own that shouldn't be edited for the sake of a comfortable dinner. When we finally stop seeking validation from those who only welcome us when we agree to stay small, we find a different kind of high ground. It's a place where the air is sharper and the path is harder, but the view is honest. In the end, the only map that matters is the one written in our own scars, and the only direction worth following is the one that leads us back to our own skin. Thank you for walking this road with me today and for honoring the weight of these stories. If this journey resonated with you, I'd be grateful to hear your thoughts in the comments. We all have those moments where we had to choose between staying silent or standing in our own truth, and I'd love to know your story. If you'd like to see more narratives exploring the grit and grace of the human experience, please consider following and subscribing. It helps keep this space alive for more voices that refuse to be erased. Until next time, keep your eyes on the North Star